Clean the bathroom before the guests arrive, and don't touch anything else, my daughter-in-law Ashley said the moment I stepped through the front door of my own son's house. I was still holding the blueberry pie I had baked that morning, the foil warm against my palms from the oven, when her words landed. Daniel stood just behind her in the hallway, one hand resting on the banister, not looking at me, not looking at her, just staring somewhere over my shoulder as if I were a delivery driver who had arrived too early. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and something roasting in the oven, and for a second I thought perhaps I had misheard her. I had driven 45 minutes across town, through Saturday traffic and construction cones, because Daniel had called the night before and said, "Mom, we'd love for you to come by tomorrow." Love. That was the word he used. Ashley's eyes moved from the pie dish to my shoes, as if checking whether I had tracked dirt onto her hardwood floors. "The guest bathroom upstairs," she added, her voice brisk, efficient. "And please don't rearrange anything." I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the one that had become my quiet companion since my husband, Thomas, passed away 2 years ago. I nodded. I have always been good at nodding. "Of course," I said, setting the pie carefully on the kitchen counter, aligning it with the edge as though neatness could restore something that had just been taken from me. The kitchen was larger than the one Daniel grew up in, with marble countertops and stainless steel appliances that gleamed under recessed lighting. I remembered scrubbing our old linoleum floors on my hands and knees after double shifts at the pharmacy, Daniel doing homework at the small oak table while Thomas read the newspaper. Back then, I cleaned because it was my home. Now, I was being assigned a task like an afterthought. I climbed the carpeted stairs slowly, my hand brushing the framed family photos that lined the wall. In one of them, Daniel was 8 years old, grinning with 2 missing front teeth, his arm wrapped around my waist at the county fair. I paused for half a heartbeat, then kept moving. The guest bathroom was already spotless. The sink shone. The towels were folded into precise rectangles. A new bar of soap sat untouched in a porcelain dish. I turned on the faucet anyway, letting the water run over my fingers, listening to its steady stream as if it could drown out the echo of Ashley's voice. "Clean the bathroom. Don't touch anything else." I picked up a cloth from under the sink and began wiping the already polished counter in slow, deliberate circles. My reflection in the mirror looked older than 72. My silver hair was pinned neatly at the nape of my neck, my cardigan buttoned all the way up despite the mild spring afternoon. I did not look like a burden. I did not look like someone who needed instructions on how to behave in her son's house. Downstairs, I could hear the murmur of Ashley's voice as she spoke on the phone, her tone warm and animated now, so different from the clipped sharpness she had used with me. Daniel laughed at something she said. The sound floated up the staircase, light and easy, and I realized I had not heard him laugh like that with me in a very long time. I rinsed the cloth, folded it carefully, and placed it back where I had found it. I did not cry. I have learned that tears are a luxury best saved for empty rooms. Instead, I straightened my shoulders and looked at myself one more time in the mirror. If I was going to stand in this house as something less than a mother, then I would stand very still, very quiet, and I would pay attention. Because silence, I have discovered, has a way of revealing what words try to hide. I walked downstairs with the same careful steps I used when Daniel was a toddler learning how to balance. Except this time, I was the one measuring every movement. Ashley was arranging flowers in a tall glass vase at the center of the dining table, white lilies trimmed to identical heights, their scent sharp and clean. Daniel stood beside the kitchen island scrolling through his phone. Neither of them asked if I needed help. Neither of them mentioned the pie. I took a seat at the edge of the breakfast nook, folding my hands in my lap as if I were waiting for an appointment. It was not always like this. After Thomas passed away, Daniel had come by every Sunday for nearly 3 months. He would bring groceries, check the smoke detectors, insist on mowing my lawn even when it only needed a light trim. He used to sit at my small kitchen table, elbows resting on the worn wood, and ask if I was sleeping well. Then gradually the visits became shorter. Then they became calls. Then they became messages that said, "We are busy this week, maybe next time." Ashley started organizing holidays at their house instead of mine. She said it made more sense since they had the bigger space. At first, I agreed. I told myself that families evolve, traditions shift. But somewhere along the way, my role shifted too. I was no longer the host. I was not even the guest of honor. I became useful. I would be invited early to help set up folding chairs on the patio or watch the children while everyone else finished getting ready. I told myself I did not mind. I had energy. I had time. I did not want to be alone in my quiet house with the ticking clock and Thomas's empty armchair. The first time Ashley corrected me in my own kitchen was last Thanksgiving. I had reached for the salt to season the turkey, and she gently moved my hand aside and said she preferred to do it her way. She smiled when she said it, but the smile did not reach her eyes. Daniel pretended not to notice. After that, I started asking before touching anything. Today felt like an extension of that pattern, only clearer. As guests began arriving, Ashley greeted them with bright enthusiasm, complimenting dresses and shaking hands. When she introduced me, she said, "This is Daniel's mom, Margaret," as though I were a distant relative visiting from out of state. One of the neighbors thanked me for coming early to help. I opened my mouth to correct him, then closed it again. I watched Daniel carry trays of appetizers into the living room. He moved easily through the crowd, confident, respected. I remembered the nights I stayed up balancing checkbooks, stretching every dollar so he could attend a good college. I remembered packing his lunches, writing small notes on napkins that said, "You have got this." I wondered if he remembered any of that when he handed me a stack of paper napkins and said, "Mom, could you refill these in the guest bathroom?" His voice was polite. It always was. That was the part that made it harder to name. Nothing here looked cruel from the outside. No one raised their voice. No one pushed me aside. And yet, as I walked back up those carpeted stairs with a stack of folded napkins in my hand, I felt something colder than anger settling into place. I was not being asked for help. I was being assigned a position. And the more I replayed the past 2 years in my mind, the more I realized this did not begin today. It began the moment I stopped being the center of the family and became an accessory to it. By the time the sun began to lower behind the maple trees in the backyard, the house felt smaller, tighter, as though the walls themselves were listening. I stayed near the edges of rooms, collecting empty glasses before anyone had to ask, wiping down the kitchen counter after each new tray of appetizers appeared. Ashley moved through the crowd in a fitted navy dress, accepting compliments about the renovation they had just completed on the downstairs living room. She explained how they had knocked out a wall to create an open-concept space, how the quartz countertops had been imported, how the custom cabinets had taken 12 weeks to install. I listened carefully to the way she said they. Not once did she mention that the down payment for this house had come from the equity Thomas and I built over 40 years in our modest 3-bedroom home across town. Daniel had called it a loan when we signed the papers at the bank. He promised they would pay it back in small monthly amounts. They made the first 3 payments. Then the checks stopped, replaced with explanations about unexpected expenses, about daycare costs, about property taxes that were higher than anticipated. I told him not to worry. I told him family did not keep score. Standing there now, watching guests admire the polished hardwood floors, I wondered if I had misunderstood the rules of the game entirely. At one point I stepped into Daniel's home office to set down a tray and noticed a folder left slightly open on his desk. I did not snoop. I have never been that kind of woman. But my name was printed clearly on a document. Near the top, bold black letters against white paper. Margaret Collins Living Trust. My breath slowed. I had created that trust years ago at Thomas's urging, long before illness entered our lives. We wanted everything organized, simple, dignified. I stepped back from the desk without touching the folder. The fact that it was open told me enough. They had been discussing it, perhaps reviewing it, perhaps planning around it. When I returned to the kitchen, Ashley was explaining to a neighbor that it was difficult having extended family drop by unannounced, that boundaries were important for young couples building their own traditions. Her tone was calm, almost educational. I realized she was speaking about me without using my name. Daniel stood beside her, nodding slowly, his expression thoughtful, as though he were considering a new idea instead of recognizing a familiar truth. I dried my hands on a dish towel and met his eyes across the room. For a fraction of a second, something flickered there. Guilt, perhaps, or discomfort. Then it was gone, replaced by the polite smile he reserves for professional colleagues and casual acquaintances. I remembered the nights he used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms, clutching his blanket, whispering that he felt safer between us. I remembered promising him that as long as I was alive, he would never have to feel alone. It occurred to me then that promises can outlive the conditions that made them meaningful. As laughter filled the living room and ice clinked in crystal glasses, I felt a quiet shift inside myself. Not anger. Not yet. Something steadier. Something clearer. I began to see the pattern not as a series of small misunderstandings, but as a deliberate reshaping of my place in their lives. I was welcome as long as I was useful. I was valued as long as I was silent. And for the first time since Thomas passed, I allowed myself to consider a different possibility. What if I did not have to accept the role they had chosen for me? What if I still had more control than they realized? The party continued around me, but I felt as though I had stepped outside of it, as if I were observing my own life from a quiet distance. I carried a tray of empty glasses back into the kitchen and placed them gently in the sink, arranging them so they would not clink too loudly. I have always believed that dignity is found in the smallest gestures. As I stood there, the hum of conversation drifting in from the living room, my thoughts moved backward through time with a clarity that surprised me. I saw Thomas at our old dining table, sleeves rolled up, explaining to Daniel how compound interest worked. I heard his steady voice telling our son that a man's character was measured not by what he owned, but by how he treated the people who helped him build it. When Thomas became ill, it was Daniel who insisted we create the living trust, who said he wanted everything organized so I would not have to worry. We sat in a quiet office downtown with polished wooden chairs and signed documents that felt heavier than the paper they were printed on. Thomas squeezed my hand under the table and said, "This is not about money. This is about respect." After he passed, I kept every document in a fireproof box in my bedroom closet. I reviewed them once a year, not because I feared losing control, but because it gave me comfort to know there was structure in a world that had suddenly become uncertain. Watching Ashley glide across the living room tonight, accepting praise for the home she and Daniel called theirs, I realized they might have mistaken my generosity for surrender. I remembered the day Daniel asked if they could use part of the trust as collateral to secure a better mortgage rate. He said it would only be temporary. He said it was a smart financial move. I agreed because I believed partnership still meant something between a mother and her child. But I never amended the core conditions Thomas and I established together. Certain protections remained in place, quiet and firm, like the foundation beneath a house that no one admires until something begins to shift. A burst of laughter echoed from the patio, and I stepped outside for fresh air. The evening breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and charcoal from the grill. String lights hung above the yard, casting a warm glow over guests who stood in small circles discussing vacations and school districts. I noticed how Ashley gently redirected conversations whenever someone asked about me. She would smile and say I was helping inside, that I preferred to stay busy. Perhaps she truly believed that was my preference. Perhaps it was easier for her to believe that than to acknowledge what was happening. Daniel joined her near the fire pit, placing a hand lightly at the small of her back. They looked like a united front, confident and settled. For a brief moment, I felt the familiar ache of wanting to step into that circle and be included without condition. Then the ache passed. In its place came something steadier. I understood now that I had been waiting for them to remember who I was. I had been hoping respect would return on its own, like a misplaced photograph rediscovered in a drawer. But respect, I realized, is not something that drifts back accidentally. It is reinforced by boundaries. It is protected by clarity. As I watched the glow of the string lights reflect off the windows of the house I helped them secure, I made a quiet decision. I would not raise my voice. I would not demand gratitude. I would simply ensure that the agreements Thomas and I built were honored exactly as written. And this time, I would read every line not as a loving mother hoping for harmony, but as a woman who understands the value of what she still holds. When the last guest finally gathered their coat and stepped out into the cool evening air, the house fell into a softer silence, the kind that reveals what conversation tries to conceal. I stood near the kitchen sink, drying a single wine glass with deliberate care while Ashley stacked plates beside me. Daniel walked a neighbor to the front door, his voice warm, promising to schedule a golf game soon. The moment the door closed, the warmth drained from the room. Ashley exhaled and glanced at the mess on the counters. She did not thank me for helping. She simply handed me a dish towel as if it had always belonged in my hands. I accepted it without a word. I have learned that silence can gather more information than questions ever could. As I wiped the marble countertop, I listened. Ashley spoke first, her tone low but firm. She said they needed to talk about the trust again, that it would be easier if everything were transferred sooner rather than later. She mentioned refinancing, property taxes, future renovations. She said, it made financial sense to consolidate assets. Daniel replied in a softer voice, one I recognized from his childhood when he was asking for permission. He said he would speak to me soon. That timing mattered. She responded that timing was exactly the issue. I kept my back turned, my movement steady. Each word felt like a small stone placed carefully into a pattern I had already begun to see. After a few minutes, Daniel stepped into the kitchen and cleared his throat. He asked if I needed help getting home. I told him I was fine. My car was parked in the driveway, the same sedan Thomas and I purchased 8 years ago, still running smoothly because we maintained it with care. Ashley leaned against the counter and said, almost casually, that it might be wise for me to consider downsizing. She mentioned that large houses were a burden at my age, that retirement communities offered social benefits. She said it kindly, with the expression of someone offering helpful advice. I nodded again. I have always been good at nodding. But inside, something had shifted from observation to resolve. I told them I would review my paperwork soon. Daniel looked relieved. Ashley smiled in a way that suggested progress. Neither of them asked what I meant by review. I gathered my purse, which still held the spare key to their house that Daniel gave me when they first moved in. As I slipped it into my coat pocket, I realized I no longer needed it. Outside, the night air was cool against my cheeks. The porch light cast long shadows across the driveway, and I paused before opening my car door. Through the front window, I could see them standing side by side in the kitchen, already discussing something with focused intensity. They looked united, strategic. For the first time, I did not feel excluded. I felt informed. On the drive home, the roads were mostly empty. Streetlights passed in steady intervals, and with each mile, I felt my thoughts settle into clarity. I would not confront them in anger. I would not accuse or argue. Tomorrow morning, I would call the attorney who drafted the trust. I would request a full review, line by line, clause by clause. I would confirm every condition Thomas and I established. If adjustments were necessary, they would be made with precision, not emotion. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the porch of my own home looked different to me. Not smaller, not lonely, but solid. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of lavender polish greeting me. I placed my purse on the entry table and walked to the closet where the fireproof box rested on the top shelf. I did not open it yet. I simply placed my hand on its cool metal surface and allowed myself one steady breath. They believed this was about convenience. They believed it was about efficiency. But I knew better. This was about understanding exactly who still held the foundation beneath their polished floors. The next morning I woke before the sun, the habit of decades rising with me even though no alarm clock demanded it. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock above the stove. I brewed a cup of coffee and carried it to the dining table where Thomas used to read the paper. Then I brought down the fireproof box from the closet shelf and set it carefully in front of me. I did not rush. I have learned that important decisions deserve steady hands. The metal latch clicked open with a small, decisive sound. Inside lay the documents we signed years ago, each page neatly organized in labeled folders. I ran my fingers over the tab that read Living Trust and opened it slowly. The language was clear, direct, written in the calm tone of a man who believed in preparation rather than panic. Certain clauses stood out immediately, especially the one Thomas insisted upon. The primary residence and any property purchased with funds derived from the trust would remain under my control during my lifetime unless I chose to amend the agreement in writing. There were also conditions regarding respectful conduct and financial responsibility tied to early distributions. At the time, those details felt almost unnecessary, like installing a security system in a neighborhood where nothing ever happened. Now they felt precise, thoughtful, protective. After finishing my coffee, I placed the documents back in order and reached for the phone. The attorney who drafted the trust, Mr. Howard Ellis, had retired, but his firm was still operating downtown in the same brick building with tall windows overlooking Main Street. I scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. The receptionist recognized my name. She said she would arrange for one of the senior partners to review the file. Her tone was professional, neutral. That steadiness comforted me. By 1 o'clock, I was seated in a leather chair across from a polished oak desk, the folder open between us. The attorney, a composed woman in her early 50s, adjusted her glasses and read carefully through each page. She confirmed what I already suspected. Nothing had been transferred. The equity Daniel and Ashley used to secure their home was still tied to the trust. Any attempt to refinance or restructure without my written consent would require formal approval. She explained that I retained full authority to revise beneficiary terms if circumstances warranted it. Her voice was calm, factual. I asked what would constitute sufficient cause for revision. She replied that financial manipulation, coercion, or documented disrespect could justify amendments. I nodded slowly, absorbing the words without visible reaction. When the meeting ended, I requested certified copies of all relevant documents and asked about the process of adding conditional provisions. The attorney assured me it could be done discreetly and legally. As I walked back to my car parked along the curb, the afternoon sun felt warmer than it had the day before. I did not feel vindictive. I felt informed. There is a difference. On the drive home, Daniel called. His voice sounded casual, almost cheerful. He asked if I had arrived safely the night before. He mentioned that Ashley thought we should discuss future plans soon. I told him I agreed. I said clarity benefits everyone. There was a pause on the line, brief but noticeable. He said he would arrange a dinner later that week. After we hung up, I pulled into my driveway and sat in the quiet for a moment. The house in front of me did not feel like a burden. It felt like an anchor. I stepped inside, placed the certified copies in the fireproof box, and closed the lid gently. For the first time in months, I did not feel like an accessory to someone else's decisions. I felt like the author of my own. 3 days later, I returned to Daniel and Ashley's house for dinner, this time arriving exactly at 6 o'clock as requested. I wore a simple navy dress and low heels, nothing dramatic, nothing that would suggest confrontation. In my handbag rested a slim folder with certified copies of the trust documents, though I had no intention of placing them on the table unless it became necessary. When Ashley opened the door, her smile was measured, almost rehearsed. She stepped aside to let me in, and I noticed the faint scent of rosemary from the kitchen. Daniel appeared moments later, kissing my cheek lightly, his gesture affectionate but distracted. We sat at the dining table beneath the same chandelier that had glowed warmly during the party. Tonight there were no guests, no background laughter to soften the air. Just the three of us and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Dinner was served neatly, plates arranged with care. For a few minutes we spoke about ordinary things. Traffic, weather, a neighbor's new fence. Then Ashley placed her fork down with gentle precision and folded her hands together. She said they had been thinking about the future. She spoke about financial efficiency, about simplifying paperwork, about ensuring everything was streamlined. Daniel added that it would be easier for everyone if ownership of certain assets were formally transferred sooner rather than later. He said it in the tone of a son trying to sound practical rather than hopeful. I listened without interrupting. When they finished, I reached for my water glass and took a slow sip. I told them I had already reviewed the trust with an attorney. Daniel's shoulders stiffened slightly. Ashley's expression remained composed, but her fingers tightened around the edge of her napkin. I explained calmly that the current structure remained intact, that any changes would require careful consideration. Ashley responded that they were only suggesting what made sense financially. I agreed that finances matter. I said clarity matters even more. I described the conditions Thomas and I established years ago, including the provisions tied to conduct and respect. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply recited the language as it was written. Daniel asked what I meant by conduct. I met his eyes steadily. I told him that generosity is not an obligation and that access to family assets is a privilege, not an entitlement. The words settled into the room with a quiet weight. Ashley attempted a small laugh and said there must be some misunderstanding. I told her there was no misunderstanding at all. I explained that the trust would remain under my full authority during my lifetime, and that any future distribution would reflect not only financial responsibility, but also the health of our relationships. Daniel leaned back in his chair, absorbing what I had said. He looked less certain now, less unified. For a moment he appeared almost like the young man who once asked me for advice before signing his first apartment lease. I placed my napkin beside my plate and stood slowly. I said I valued harmony. but harmony requires mutual regard. I assured them I was not withdrawing support. I was simply clarifying boundaries. Ashley remained silent. Daniel walked me to the door. As he opened it, the porch light cast a pale glow across his face. He asked softly whether everything was all right between us. I told him that everything depended on what happened next. Then I stepped into the cool evening air, not hurried, not shaken. I felt steady. For the first time since Thomas passed away, I sensed that the foundation beneath this family was no longer assumed. It was defined. The morning after that dinner, my phone remained silent. No message from Ashley clarifying her intentions. No call from Daniel softening the edges of the conversation. I did not expect one. When boundaries are introduced into a room that has long been comfortable without them, silence is often the first response. I moved through my day as usual. I watered the small row of hydrangeas along my front walkway, measured exactly 12 feet from porch to mailbox, trimmed carefully so they would bloom evenly in summer. I drove to the grocery store and selected produce with the same patience I have practiced for decades. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Internally, everything had. 2 days later, Daniel called and asked if he could stop by alone. His voice was subdued, less assured than usual. I told him he was welcome anytime. When he arrived that evening, he stood in my doorway for a moment as though uncertain whether to step fully inside. I invited him in and offered coffee. He accepted. We sat at the same dining table where Thomas once balanced our budget with a yellow legal pad. Daniel looked around the room as if seeing it differently, perhaps noticing the framed photographs, the carefully maintained hardwood floors, the absence of extravagance. He began by saying he never meant to make me feel sidelined. He said they were simply trying to plan responsibly. I listened without interruption. Then he admitted that Ashley had been researching ways to consolidate assets and believed early transfers would make refinancing easier. He said it would reduce monthly payments by a few $100s. I nodded slowly. A few $100s can seem significant when viewed narrowly. I asked him whether he understood the conditions written into the trust. He hesitated. He said he knew there were guidelines, but he assumed they were flexible. I told him flexibility is not the same as surrender. I explained that the trust was designed not only to distribute wealth, but to preserve respect. I reminded him that financial partnership does not eliminate accountability. Daniel rubbed his hands together the way he used to before taking a difficult exam. He asked whether I was planning to change anything. I answered honestly. I said I was considering amendments that would clarify expectations moving forward. His expression shifted, not into anger, but into recognition. He asked what that meant for him and Ashley. I told him it meant that access would depend on conduct, transparency, and mutual regard. I added that generosity flows more freely in an environment of trust. The room was quiet for several seconds. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street. Daniel finally said he had not realized how the past year had appeared from my side. He admitted that sometimes it was easier to follow Ashley's lead than to question it. I did not criticize him. I simply said that leadership within a marriage does not require erasing one's origins. When he stood to leave, he hugged me more firmly than he had in months. It was not dramatic. It was not tearful, but it was different. After he drove away, I returned to the fireproof box and removed the documents once more. I added a new page prepared by the attorney, outlining revised conditions tied explicitly to respect and communication. I signed it with a steady hand. I did not feel triumphant. I felt aligned. Whatever happened next would unfold within boundaries that were no longer implied. They were written. 2 weeks passed before I returned to Daniel and Ashley's house again, this time for a quiet Sunday lunch that Ashley suggested herself. The invitation was different in tone, less assumptive, more measured. When I arrived, Ashley greeted me at the door with a softness that felt intentional. She asked if I would like to sit in the living room while she finished preparing the meal. She did not hand me a dish towel. She did not assign me a task. Daniel came in from the backyard carrying a bag of potting soil and smiled in a way that reached his eyes. There was still caution in the air, but there was also awareness. We sat down together at the dining table, and before any food was served, Ashley cleared her throat. She said she had been reflecting on our last conversation. She admitted that in her focus on building a future, she may have overlooked the foundation that made it possible. Her words were careful, chosen one by one. Daniel added that he should have spoken up sooner when small comments crossed a line. He said he did not want convenience to replace gratitude. I listened, not searching their faces for perfection, only for sincerity. I told them that wealth can be rebuilt, homes can be refinanced, but respect, once fractured, takes intention to restore. Ashley nodded slowly. She said she never intended to diminish my role. I answered that intention matters, but impact matters more. There was no accusation in my voice, only clarity. After lunch, Daniel asked if I would like to see the changes they planned for the backyard. We walked outside together. The grass stretched wide and green, bordered by a wooden fence that stood about 6 feet tall. He spoke about adding a small garden, perhaps planting tomatoes in the spring. I suggested heirloom varieties that grow well in our climate. For the first time in a long while, the conversation felt balanced. Not because I held documents in a fireproof box, not because of legal clauses or amendments, but because boundaries had shifted the tone. Later, as I prepared to leave, Ashley walked me to the door. She paused and said she hoped I would continue to be involved in their lives, not out of obligation, but out of choice. I told her involvement thrives where it is welcomed with respect. She understood. When I stepped outside, the afternoon sunlight warmed my shoulders. I did not feel victorious. I felt steady. Back at my own home, I placed the revised trust documents back in their box and returned it to the closet shelf. I knew the provisions were there if needed. But more importantly, I knew I no longer needed to shrink to maintain peace. That evening, Daniel called to ask about the tomato varieties again, writing down each detail carefully. His voice carried a note of attentiveness that had been missing before. As I ended the call, I looked around my quiet living room, at the framed photograph of Thomas smiling beside me at our 40th anniversary. I whispered that the foundation we built still stood. Respect had not returned by accident. It had returned because I chose to define it. And in doing so, I did not lose my son. I simply reminded him who I have always been.